How long will the human species last once AI takes over?
Oh my goodness. Anybody can be a leader.
Call them influencers, not leaders.
Do you think that it's more challenging now to be a leader than it was?
It's different challenges.
How do you make a leader?
Well, they got to be born in order to be made. Some people choose it. Others, the helicopter parents want to choose it for them.
I can't imagine doing something like that. I don't know how to lead anymore.
What's your one core value? You can make up a list of 5 values a lot faster than you can make up a list of 1.
Hey everyone, it's Jacob. Welcome to another episode of Leading the Future of Work. Today's guest is Bruce Avolio, Dr. Bruce Avolio. He is a professor of management at the University of Washington Foster School of Business. And I wanted to talk to Bruce because he has done an enormous amount of research in the world of leadership. In fact, he's been in the field longer than I've been alive. Since 1983, I think he's been involved in all things leadership related, if not longer. He has done a lot of research in this space. He used to be the director at the Gallup Leadership Institute. He has held positions. He was the Clifton Chair in Leadership for a while. He's been the co-director of the Eisenhower Leadership Development Project in the 90s. He's been everywhere. He was the co-director of the Kellogg Leadership Program in the 90s as well. So he has been around the leadership block, so to speak. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to him. So today's conversation is focused, I'd say, overarching theme is on are leaders born or are they made? And we take a little bit of an academic look in some of the aspects of leadership and kind of the history where we got to where we are today. And we try to answer that very high level question, are leaders born or are leaders actually made? And if they are made, how do you make them? If they are born, does that mean that you're hopeless if you're not born a leader? What do you do? So some of the themes that we look at are some of the trends going on in the world of leadership, how it's evolved over the years. We look at some of the research that he's done, including the research on how the approval of a CEO has a big impact on if the board retains the CEO. So in other words, if employees like the CEO and have a high approval rating of him, chances are the board is going to retain that CEO. He talks about some of the research he did there. We also look at transactional versus transformational leadership and what's been going on in that realm. And we touch a little bit on things like self-awareness, innovation, but the overarching theme again is looking at if leaders are born or are leaders made. It's a really fascinating conversation. Again, has a little bit of that academic spin, but also a lot of practical nuggets that you can apply inside of your organization and in your leadership journey as well. And I find it to be a fascinating conversation, and I hope you will enjoy it as well. Well, why don't we start with a very easy softball question, Bruce, and that is, are leaders born or are they made?
Well, they got to be born in order to be made. So they got to start somewhere. But in a less glib response to that is there is evidence that there is some heritability to leadership, like energy. We know that people need energy to actually go out and advance and do something that other people are willing to follow. So energy is something that we know is connected to our physiology and kind of what we're born with. But if you put it together, whether it's intelligence or and there's a lot of issues around how much is needed to be effective, or at least to understand and make sense of what other people are doing. The numbers are pretty low for heritability compared to made. And then the biogeneticists told me when we did this research, and other people now that have done it, they're like, why do you even ask the question? Because don't you know that evolution actually is the environment and the human species interacting with each other in ways that are dynamic? And so is it environment or is it heritable? It's always both.
Yeah.
Because the environment's changing the way people's brains are structured right now. We call that, the phone, which is no longer a phone we carry around, or the technology we're using is having an impact. So here's the other way I think really to look at this question. Why is it that people have such a strong implicit theory that leadership is born? And some people really do. And that makes them less developmentally ready to actually learn to be a leader.
Yeah, and I mean, going to your point, I think it's probably a combination of both, right? I mean, everyone is born with certain attributes and qualities and traits, but if you subscribe to the Carol Dweck theory of having a growth mindset, then if you just believe that you're born with what you have and you can't get better and you can't develop, then that would be what you would call a fixed mindset, right?
Right,
You can't learn, you can't grow, you can't develop, and I don't think it's not a very encouraging way to live or to lead, for that matter.
right,
So it's true, right? I mean, some people, and I see this with my kids. I have a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old, and sometimes you look at your kids and you say, "Wow, she's inherently social, or is a good speaker, or is able to just pick things up." But at the same time, there are probably some things that she is not as
right.
developed or capable in. So I think anybody who kind of goes with that approach of leaders have to be born, I don't know. It just seems like a very negative, fixed way to approach it.
Yeah, they call it an entity perspective, versus kind of an incremental.
Yeah.
An entity is, the package we're given. And, maybe people in eugenics think in that way, where you're actually picking people for certain qualities and traits, as you use the term. But even traits are somewhat of a misnomer because we know that traits are actually more elastic than we thought.
Hmm.
So, for example, people as they go through life become either more liberal or conservative. So it changes the way that we would say they not only behave, but who they were. People who, as they go through life, become more generative. And I'm talking about the normal aging process, not the disease process. And so people do change over time. People become more functioning. Introverts become more extroverted. They functioning in terms of being more extroverted. A lot of CEOs I've met are extremely introverted, very high strategic thinkers, but had to develop the muscle to be extroverted. But now they're seen as extroverted. So how much is it's really born is limiting them. They're actually changing that. What people would say wouldn't change.
Hmm. So if we go with that premise that anybody can be a leader, maybe it makes sense first, before we dive into that into more detail, is to look at what does that even mean? Because you've been studying leadership for many, many decades. Are there some specific things that you've noticed over the past few decades that have evolved and changed as far as what leadership means?
Right.
What was it like in the 70s, 80s, 90s versus what it is today? Has that definition changed for you at all in how we think about leadership?
Yeah. Some of it has, and some of the fundamentals have not changed at all. But I think if we go back past before the 70s to the 1700s, perhaps, or 1800s, we had a much higher population of leaders that were born to lead. And I think this might be one of the reasons why we think leadership is born, because you couldn't be king unless you were born to be king. And so we're not that far away from that period of time. In fact, on every People magazine, we noticed that Harry and Meghan and William and Kate and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we're so fascinated by this stuff. They're very much a part of who we still are, but they're not in the positions that they were in. So leadership was born in the not so distant past in many cases, even in families that ran businesses or ran, municipalities. Look at Chicago, the Dailies, the families, put those people into positions. And you could say, well, is that born, or is it just a manipulation of getting people into those roles of power? So I think what's happened is in the last, 100 years, and then the last 50 years, is there is a growing diversification of what constitutes, what are the roles and requirements and demands for leadership.
Hmm.
And so, for example, if you say, well, look at all these leaders, like, people like Bill Gates or Elon Musk, and others like that, even Elizabeth Holmes, and who's not doing so well these days, from Theranos. But she falls into that category, and we're seeing it as much with men as with women. that they see the world in a very different way. Mark Zuckerberg. We can even say, well, I wonder, is these people on this spectrum that they talk about? Probably. And sometimes, definitely. And so the definition of who is a leader is evolving, right? So, in the past, the strongest and probably the most connected were the leaders and who accumulated strong power. But now we have soft power has grown tremendously
Yeah.
in terms of the ability for, now we even call them influencers, right? Are influencers not leaders?
Yeah, I guess it depends on how you. Yeah, if you go with the definition that somebody who can make change happen, then yeah, I guess in some way, even if you have Instagram followers, right? I mean, a million Instagram followers or a million followers on Twitter, if you can make some kind of change happen without coming from a place of authority,
Right.
then I suppose that does make you a leader in some capacity. And then it kind of makes you wonder, is there a difference between leader and influencer? Or because it seems kind of funny to say that somebody with a lot of followers on Instagram is a leader. But at the
Mm,
same time, it also makes sense to say that to be a leader, you have to be able to influence people.
right. Well, that's kind of the core. I mean, if you look at most textbooks of leadership, um, people will describe it very simply as a process of social influence, which facilitates the movement of people towards a goal that is desirable, as opposed to a compliance and saying, well, yes, that's kind of leadership, but if the person isn't willingly doing it, have you really led them in a way that we'd like to think, at least, of some of the middle to higher ends of leadership in terms of process, like social processes.
Hmm.
So I think influencers are leaders. There's no doubt. People will make choices in their careers and lives based on influencers. So my point was, we're expanding the domain that falls within this broader thing we call leadership, which is to socially influence people to do something that willingly. I think influencers do that. I think we've seen a big change in the power of the peer. The peers have an enormous effect on the ability of leaders to get anything done, and also to learn how to do it better. So if you look at every business school program and mostly other programs like our institutions in business, a lot of stuff is done in teams and with peers. And the power of the peer is something that we haven't really studied to the extent we've studied the other way, the up down influence, more vertical. And I think that's a big change.
Hmm.
And I think what's happening also is leaders of organizations are getting together and working with each other on problems that are too complex for any one organization or discipline to take on. So our greatest discoveries usually occur at the boundaries of our knowledge domain, not in the center. In the center is where we perfect the idea. At the boundaries is where we get this trigger of never thought of that. Biologists think that way, anthropologists think that way, but maybe we don't in, say, industrial psychology. So I think those are some changes that are really having a really profound impact on how we construe leadership. And we're right in the middle of that mix right now
Yeah.
and trying to figure it out.
Hey, really quick. Do you want to hear something crazy? Over 96% of the people who watch these videos on this channel are not subscribed. Why don't we fix that? If you want to get access to more awesome videos just like this one, make sure to hit subscribe so you'll get notified when they get released. So if we were to kind of simplify and recap what that big change is, it seems like the influence piece was a big part of it, right?
Mhm.
Is that primarily how would you describe or explain the change that we're seeing as far as what it means to be a leader over the past several decades?
Well, it means not to necessarily be a white male in many societies. Well, societies that were the majority. It means not necessarily to be a male. It means that we accept a broader range of profiles, so to speak, of what what constitutes someone that would be in leadership roles. It's also changing the way things are changing the way leaders communicate their leadership to others, like we're doing right now, and the way we're talking with each other. I mean, we've been doing this for a long time, and particularly intensively in the last 2 to 3 years
Yep.
because of the pandemic. So it's not unnatural to interact this way. In fact, a lot of companies right now are laying off people this way. Not a good thing. In fact, someone said we should. Someone told me yesterday, I don't feel like I have any courage if I do it this way. I think there's no courage in laying someone off over, the screen looking at them this way. I should be in the room with them. That person was from probably in their mid to late 50s. So maybe someone younger would say, well, you can lay them off on, Zoom or anything else.
Yeah.
Was it really matter? But she felt, she's a pretty senior leader. She said, I should be in the room. I feel like there's something about the human connection that's there. So I think that's changing, is like, how do you have that connection when you're not necessarily in the room and having the physical proximity effects of being with people and the dynamics that go with that versus doing it this way. Those things are changing, and also we have to worry about things like voice now, and voice is that 5 people in the room are speaking 5 different languages.
Yeah.
That navigating that around a language that everyone has to speak, and 4 of the people don't speak it natively. It's not a native language. Another complexity.
Yeah, no, it's because, I mean, I don't know if you would agree with this, but I think that there's never been a harder time to be a leader. Especially now, there's kind of this balance of like, be honest and transparent, but there's cancel culture.
Right.
There's social media where people can say, you misstep and say the wrong thing, and people can come after you very quickly.
Right.
Do you think that it's more challenging now to be a leader than it was even, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago?
I think it's different challenges.
Yeah.
I think there's a broader spectrum of challenges that leaders are facing. One is that people have information before you can even get it out. So that, if information is a big source of power, that power has been distributed in a lot of cases. But now it's being manipulated because people are creating information that's disinformation. And that's one of the ways they hold their leadership roles. So yeah, in that sense, I do think that it's more challenging. People had challenges that made their jobs maybe as difficult every day as our leaders are today. But the challenges are different. They're more dynamic. They're faster. Things come back to you quicker, and things will block you quicker. And the messaging, just take that messaging, trying to get your message out.
Yeah.
It's very, very difficult for people to do. You have to be very careful about how you translate it and communicate it, and where and when, to be able to get it out to the right ears and eyes.
Especially with all the different platforms that we have at our disposal nowadays.
Right.
It used to be just kind of show up to work, and now you have so many different things that you can use. So let's talk a little bit about this, going back to the original theme of leaders
Yeah.
being made, not born, because I tend to lean towards that made quality, or that made side of the equation.
Yeah.
So what does that actually mean? How do you make a leader? And I know that's a very broad question. I'm not even sure where to begin with that. So do leaders make themselves? Is somebody responsible for making you? Like, how do you even begin to kind of go down that path?
Well, the answer to the 30 things you said is yes, yes, and yes. I mean, yes, people make it themselves. Yes, people support them in doing it. Some even take responsibility for it. And it's like when you have a 2 and a 6-year-old, you're taking responsibility for building their capacity to lead themselves through whatever the next phase is going to be. Like, you're going to go into kindergarten. Okay, I want you to be your own person, and I want you to be able to enjoy it, but also take a stand. And, as you go through further and you're 6 years old, now the power of the peer is coming in. Gee, I wonder what I'm wearing today. Should I wear this? I wonder if people are going to make fun of me, et cetera, et cetera. Probably the 2-year-old's not as worried about that.
No, 6-year-old definitely already is.
6-year-old is particularly um, young girls. I mean, we're seeing the
Yeah.
stress levels of young girls by the time they're 12 or 13 years old, manifested in very high levels of stress, and a third of them thinking seriously about suicide. So you
Yeah, I
got
saw
these.
that recent study that came out.
Yeah, sorry.
No, no, no. I was going to say I saw that study that came out. I mean, I couldn't believe it. That was absolutely terrifying to see that.
Well,
And
so
I don't know if
yeah, so there's these pressures to answer your question, there's these pressures that are there that are challenges that could be used to also help people develop the kind of skills they need to influence others. So for me, there has to be a readiness. So a fundamental principle for us, we were just talking before I came in to do this about a person that's a member of an organization that is very vested in the work we're doing with them around development. But this one person is always not showing up, whether they're there or not. And our feeling is they're not ready for a variety of reasons. They're just not developmentally ready, motivationally, or even capability wise, or the point they are in their life. And so there has to be self in it, because you have to define how you're going to lead yourself before you're doing the kind of things you influence others. Otherwise, you're
yeah.
just all over the place.
Hmm.
But it's also done by others through feedback. You can't be aware as a leader without feedback. So it has to come from your own, maybe feedback to yourself at the end of the day in a reflection. It has to come from others as well. And then there's the context. When you put people into a different context and understand, they start to really pull information in ways that they don't when they're comfortable. So if you provide a little bit of disruption, that has a way of getting people to trigger maybe some different ways they think they need to lead. Like, why in this culture do they spend so much time at dinner? Can't we just eat dinner and keep moving on? Well, it's called socialization in some cultures. And what about time? In some cultures, we don't respect time. We're late, and that's okay. But in other cultures, you better be there on time, otherwise, it's seen as being disrespectful. So, all three of those things really matter to choosing. And I think that developing, I like to call it the narrative, where what is your narrative for leadership? You talk about born or made, it's part of your narrative. But everyone has a narrative, and the arc of that narrative is determined in part by you. Like what's in chapter 1, 2, and 3 is probably less you, but now at age 6, 7, 8, and 9, you start to say, "Well, I'm creating my own narrative,"
Yeah.
and that to me is, it's kind of a good metaphor for leadership development.
I think one of the challenges that also some leaders have is they don't even create that narrative for themselves.
Yeah,
They sort of just go with how things are going, and they don't take that ownership, that control. They don't take a step back and say, this is the kind of leader I want to be. These are what my values are. This is what I believe in. This is how I'm going to convey that to everybody else. It's sort of just kind of, I don't know. It's almost like passive leadership, or having a passive narrative where you're just drifting around in, some general story, or maybe even somebody else's story. But very few people, I find, are really willing to sit down, take control, and steer the ship and steer the story in the direction that they want to go in.
right.
Do you
Well, I
find that
think that
too?
it depends, like where they are. I'm a lifespan psychologist, in my roots, and I kind of look at this as in early parts of people's development, a lot of the narratives is determined by other people. But as you are asked to take more responsibility for things, that's where you have an opportunity to really create the narrative. I think some people choose it. Others, the helicopter parents want to choose it for them and hover over them so that they don't have a chance. And I think we're seeing some of that coming through now in today's world in terms of coming into universities and things that, it's not uncommon for faculty of mine. I don't teach undergraduates, but faculty of colleagues saying, I'll get calls from parents asking like why this is on the test. I mean, it's So they're steering the narrative, and their kids are now adults, by definition.
It's
Um,
terrifying. I can't imagine doing something like that.
yeah. Well, sometimes you do it because it's safety issues, right? But a lot of times it's now much more purposively done by, and I'm not saying every culture. I mean, we have the benefits of doing that in this culture in, North America, but other cultures that might even have the resources to even think about that.
Hmm.
But I do think that a lot of people go through a good part of their life without a sense of purpose, and there are certain things that trigger that. Other people get their purpose by watching what their role models do. It could be their kindergarten teacher, it could be a coach, it could be their parents, significant others, brother, sister, and that they have an advantage because they can see what purpose looks like.
Hmm.
But a lot of people that I tend to work with, like, say, MBA students who come in who are engineers and technologists and so forth. One day they're like, I really want to move to something that influences people to do the work, not to be the tinker and making the machines and so forth, or the software or whatever. And they are really starting to look at this and say, I don't know what my purpose is now because I've been
Hmm.
trained to do something completely different. And I think that's a really interesting period to get them and help them kind of work through that self discovery.
Yeah. No, so where does that actually come from? And how do you, maybe getting back to the theme of the narrative, how do you develop that narrative for yourself? I mean, I get the childhood part, but a certain point, right? You're in your 20s, you're in your 30s, 40s, and maybe you're an entry level employee or a mid level leader. At a certain point, right, you need to take a step back and start to think about, like, what is my narrative? How do I create it?
Right.
So how do you even begin to do that? Is it just kind of journaling, thoughtful reflection on your life and where you want to go? How does that process of narrative come to be?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things I think that can be done to do that, but I'll take a tangible one that I would do with a lot of people. Particularly people probably in their at least their early teens on up to whatever pick whatever age. Is I asked them to identify, after talking about this, what does it mean to be a respected leader? And everybody
Hmm.
has an implicit theory of the positive attributes of leadership.
Yeah.
Someone that makes me feel like I'm important, someone who takes the time to invest in me, someone that seems to be able to look around a corner and do some in a way that is not threatening and enjoys the exploration of ambiguity, uncertainty, blah blah blah. So they do that. They say all those things. Happens in most every culture or on Earth, even though it's manifested different. All right, and then I say, all right, well, why don't you go interview somebody you really respect? I mean, anybody. So I asked my MBA class a few weeks ago to do this. Most pivotal experience I've had. I'm like, God,
Hmm.
really? This can't be the most pivotal. I can't believe what I thought was born is clearly not. I learned so much about what their experiences were. So now they're getting an oral sort of history from someone they respect. And I've had people literally interview the senior leaders, if not top leaders of major companies. By the way, they usually never turn down the interview.
Hmm.
They oftentimes not sure what it is it going to be recorded and all this stuff. And then rarely do they turn it down because you're going to say to someone, I don't want you to interview me. If I'm your respected leader, no, I don't want to do that. So 90 plus high percent, they do it. Here's the interesting thing is that people interviewed, I always tell them it's a 45-minute interview. And I've done them. I've done many. You can do it in 45 minutes. It's rare that it's less than an hour and a half.
Hmm.
Yes, why? Because it's not the interviewer, it's the interviewee. And the interviewee typically says, I have not done this in a while. I did it when I was thinking about how I wanted to move into roles of leadership. And now that I'm in it, I don't take the time to think about it. So I think at both ends, getting the person to think about what it is to see it. Actually, it's like learning about, what's it like to live in another culture or country.
Yeah.
We can embed them in the metaverse, but I think until you actually smell the food or, walk on the land or, go into an area where you're clearly the only one that's that color, and everyone else is different than you and speaking a different language, you don't realize how accommodated you are to your own culture. And I think the same is true with leadership, is you get to see people through this interview. I'm giving you just one example. I've had students come back to me and said, 2 years later, they'll say, I've done 7 or 8 of the interviews now.
Wow.
And all it is exploring the lifespan of a leader who you respect and asking them to kind of give an oral history of the things in a short amount of time of what influenced them. So that's one way, but I think it gets at a lot of things like role modeling, observing, making sense of the leadership experience in a way that they want to listen to them because they picked them because they respected the leader. So
Yeah.
they're going to listen.
Yeah, that's an interesting tech. And I guess anybody could even do that, especially if there's a leader at your company that you admire and respect, right? And just say, hey, can we just grab coffee? I just want to talk to you about some of the things that influenced you in your life and, kind of learn from that. But even that, I don't feel like a lot of people even have those conversations, right? We don't really talk to our leaders. I don't know how many people listening or watching this have ever emailed a leader that they look up to and admire to try to get 30 or 45 minutes with them to ask about that. But I think so. It sounds like other people's narratives and other people's paths can kind of help shape your own as well when it comes to leadership.
Very much so. And I think that's the model that actually works really well.
Yeah.
And it starts with a super peer who is a little bit ahead of you. I say super in the sense that they move further along. And that makes you feel like, well, they're a peer and I'm not that far away. Whereas when people go to interview their most respected leader and they're a CEO, they feel such a distance sometimes.
Yeah.
But then they kind of realize they're actually pretty much like me in many ways. They study engineering.
Yeah.
They felt like they were an imposter when they first started out. They were worried that they would be, identified. Like, how did you ever get to this level? Just like me, just like I would say the way I feel.
Yeah, I think taking that approach to kind of create your narrative and story makes a lot of sense. And it's, I think, pretty practical. And it's something anybody can do. Like, there's no reason why you can't actually go about and do that. I wanted to shift gears slightly and talk about some of the research that you've done. And as I was going through some of your literature, there were two studies that particularly caught my eye, and there's probably many, many more that you don't even have listed on there. One was you did research on employee approval of a CEO and how that dictates whether the board will retain that CEO.
Right.
Which I thought was very interesting. So can you talk a little bit about what that research was and how you found it? Because when I saw that, I immediately thought of the importance of employee experience, the importance of putting people first, and I immediately thought of not just the board and the CEO of the company, but also just the leader of a team or the leader of a function, and kind of thinking it from that angle. So can you talk a little bit about the research and what you found?
Yeah. And if after this session, remind me, because ASU, two of my colleagues on the paper, we and David Wallman is also well known in leadership. And we has more strategy than kind of macro micro, and that was the beauty of this team is we were very macro micro in how we looked at this. So the strategy people look at things like how boards make decisions and things like that.
Yeah.
Top management teams. And remind me because the ASU wrote a nice article on it. Actually, I posted online as a summary of that paper, a video I did. It's like a few minute video that my team asked me to do. But this article by ASU is really good, well done. It's like about 2 or 3 pages, and it's for the business schools, whatever, social media platform. I can send that to you, it might be helpful. But in a nutshell, when I was going in to talk about different companies number of years back, I used to look on Glassdoor.com to see how the CEO was rated by the employees. And there's quite a bit of variance in how CEOs are seen. Sometimes CEOs have tens of thousands of ratings, and sometimes they have not. And when I would look at that, like I usually would look at that when I was getting towards talking about how do you change an organization? Not just change an organization, transform an organization. So I see change, most change is incremental. That's important. That's the way we evolve. But transformative change is where there's a clear kind of leap with, a qualitative, developmental psychologists call it like a stage shift in the way you do things. So I'm not saying stages are relevant here, but it's more a fundamental shift that's vertical, that you're going up to a level that you didn't understand before. So I started to look at that, and I'd come into class and say, hey, do you know how Satya Nadella is rated? For people from Microsoft here in Seattle. And a lot of times they didn't know, some did. A lot of times they had no idea. More often today they do, and the boards do, because they follow social media, Glassdoor being one. So I just go in there and say, his rating is 94%. Now, if he went to Boeing, has gone through some turbulent times the last 6-7 years, and you look at McNerney's ratings, you find out, his approval ratings are about 40%.
Wow.
So he's before Calhoun. He's also part of the lineage of Jack Welch, from GE and that whole school of thought. And if you look at 40% and 94%, I'll say a simple question. You have a major change you want to implement in your organization. Which one do you think will be listened to more readily? The one with Nadella or the one with McNerney? And, it's obvious that if 60% of the people don't favor the CEO, getting legislation passed, so to speak, is going to be difficult. So I started getting interested there. And then when we sat down, I had gotten a lot. You can kind of scrape all the data off of some of these sites like Glassdoor.com, and it was kind of beyond my kind of technical knowledge to really use it in a way that I thought could be interesting. So I talked to Dave and some of his colleagues, and we got together, and we had several studies we were looking at, and this was one of the first that popped, because one of the areas that there's not a lot of research on is how boards actually make these consequential decisions.
Yeah.
We don't know. It's kind of a black box. Some of it has to be confidential, but a lot of it we just don't know. So that's what came about. And what we found, looking at a lot of data and a lot of CEOs and a lot of financial data and controlling for everything under the sun, in terms of variables, like the industry, the products produced, this and that. We found that social media opinion matters to decisions that boards make. I actually interviewed 20 board members, so qualitatively, but the quantitative data supported that it does have an effect on whether boards will keep a CEO. If the performance of the company is poor, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Because they're already wondering why they're keeping the CEO. It matters when the company's performance is actually good. And in that case, you might have a lousy CEO just basically is able to drain choke the performance out of the organization. And they might be doing it in the short term well, but in the long term, it might fall apart. And so that's where I think employee sentiment comes into being. And right now, I think that's going to be a growing concern for people in those leadership roles, back to challenges that leaders in the past didn't face. Now everyone's being Yelp rated, and whether you're a
Yeah.
professor, whether you're a podcast, whether you're a CEO, everything is getting evaluated, and you're exposed in a lot of different ways. So I think we hit on something. Actually, it's getting a lot of attention. A lot of people are pinging us on that particular study. It's interesting you picked that out.
Huh. Yeah, I mean, at the same time, it shouldn't be that surprising, right? Like if you are viewed favorably, then you should be in your position longer. If you're not viewed favorably, then you shouldn't be in your position, or your approval rating should be lower. But it was interesting to actually kind of see the data behind it, because it's not like when these board members are making the decisions, it's not to imply that they're looking at the Glassdoor ratings and saying, "Oh, this person's Glassdoor rating is high or low. That's why we should fire them." It kind of sounds like it's just a part of that culture where people can tell if a CEO is liked or not liked, and if they should be there or not.
Well, the boards don't know, though, in a lot of cases, because they're being given limited information from the inside.
Yeah.
Some CEOs, particularly ones that are actually the chairman of and CEO, and also they have appointed a lot of the board members, which is another variable we found was really important because they get to control the board's intake. And by doing so, the board may, I mean, certainly board members might look, at information beyond what they're getting from the company, but a lot of them do rely upon that book they get or file now, where they're being fed stuff,
Hmm.
and it may not be as balanced. So, just interviewing board members, we found that actually a lot of them go way beyond Glassdoor and look at other social media sites. And they're aware of things written about the company, sometimes in less or more favorable um, publications. So they are aware of it, and many, almost all of them said, "We're getting briefed on these now in our meetings." Where they come in and they share. Now there's more sites like Glassdoor.
Yep.
I mean, Glassdoor is being used a lot too for job searching. Um, like, what company do you want to go work for? Like, what's the culture like? Things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
For sure. Huh.
yeah.
That's interesting. And before we jump into some action items, I wanted to touch on one more piece of research that you did on transactional versus transformational leadership. And this too, I think, is very relevant in today's time. Right? Transformational. I think a lot of people can kind of tell what the difference is, but can you quickly talk about the difference between those two and what you found from that research?
Yeah. Well, it's a long line, that started with Jim Burns, who was a political scientist, and he wrote a book called Leadership. That was it. That's great. It's an easy thing to remember. I don't have to look up his citation. You know, it's Jim Burns Leadership,
I'm
Free
actually
Press,
looking it up as we speak.
New York, Free Press. That's it. So Jim just passed away last couple of years, but Jim studied presidents, first Roosevelt through Clinton in his career, and wrote some of the most authoritative biographies of some of those presidents. And he found that and he just looked at other senior leaders in the administration, but kind of found that there are certain presidents that come with a mindset to be instrumental, build on things, um, make things hopefully better or better in terms of their ideology. And then there are presidents that look at we need to break from here and go with something really different.
Yeah.
And so he talked about transactional and transformative leadership or transforming leadership as being two kind of opposite ends. Like, you're either one or the other. That was the original formulation. And when Bernie Bass and then and myself and other colleagues that we were working with at the time, we read Jim's book and we like, is it really like either or? And Bernie was of the position it's not. And Burns, by the way, later in life actually changed that. He said, you're right. You can be both. In fact, that is the optimum, is to be both. And you have to be transactional to get things done. Like, 80% of my day to day, it's transactional.
Yeah.
I had this meeting, that meeting, deliverables, going through things with our staff, meeting with a director here, mapping out some kind of program. But a part of the day is oftentimes around things that are transformative. So if you think about transactional as kind of the instrumental way of getting things done, getting the trains to run, stay on the tracks, and to do so safely, all that stuff. Everything happens in our world through good transactions if things are working well. That's true in the relationships as well, setting goals, expectations, things like that. The bridge over to transformational is where you start to think about things like, you know, I think that this podcast that Jacob is doing is great, but I think he's got so much more potential from which he can then kind of grow his own base. And I'm just seeing that in him, and I don't even know if he sees it in himself. And that's the kind of individualization that goes on when a transformational leader is trying to be a steward of someone's development in a very genuine sense. Then, that sort of leader also, instead of using the system as is, challenges it.
Yeah.
Where instead of delivering things in trucks on roads, let's deliver them. So it's like, let's try drones. Maybe we can use drones and drop packages in people's houses. Maybe that's another way. So they start to think about it, and they challenge the assumptions, the frameworks, the way things are going, like we're seeing in immunotherapy right now. Oh, don't forget, the human body also does take diseases on, but what it usually does is it brings all the tanks in and blows up everything. And so a lot of times the immune system will kill things it shouldn't. Oh, if we trigger it and make it more precise, then maybe we can come up with precision medicine, and that might be a cure for many diseases, the body being the front combat. But we got to train them like a special force. They can't just go in there and blow up everything.
Yeah.
That's the second part of it. And the third part of it is, I might say to you, I think there's more potential. You're saying, I'm very happy doing this podcast, and I don't need to do anything else. My family's fine. I'm fine. I get to have a good balanced life, and I'm trying to inspire you to say, but you need to get this out to the world in a way that maybe there are other mechanisms you haven't thought of. And then, the final part of that is that, so there's the energy, there's the intellectual challenge, there's the needs and development. And the last part is, if you don't trust who I am, if you don't believe in who I have been and become, then why would you do it? And that's kind of the highest end of transformational. You could say it's the moral, the ethical, the setting the high bar standards, the values, that it's to do more for people than I'll ever get out of it.
Well, I'm not quite at that the Joe Rogan podcast level yet, but if I was, I would say I don't need to do anything else. I get millions of listeners per episode. Maybe one day.
Joe's a has-been. No,
Maybe.
I'm just kidding.
Hey, you know what? If that's a has-been, I am more than happy to be that kind of a has-been.
Right.
So we only have a couple minutes left. I wanted to devote the last few minutes of the show to give some practical tips or advice for leaders out there for how they can, I don't know, become better, apply some of these concepts and themes that we've been talking about today inside of their lives. So going back to kind of our original conversation around how leadership is changing, if you were coaching leaders today and they were coming to you and saying, Bruce, the world is changing like crazy. Everything I learned in school now as a leader is no longer relevant. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to lead anymore.
Right.
Where would you begin? What advice would you give these leaders? How would you coach them? You won't want to miss my conversation with Bruce Avolio as it continues for paid subscribers at greatleadership.substack.com. And if you want to get access to this bonus episode where Bruce shares what makes a great leader, the importance of figuring out your one core value, and also how to lead in today's rapidly changing world, then again, head over to greatleadership.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber over there and join the community. If you subscribe, you're going to get access to one of these bonus episodes every single week. You will also get in-depth weekly weekly articles that I write. And you will also get access to a third thing, and that is a 5-minute weekly video where I share a leadership hack or a strategy that a CEO has shared with me. Again, all of this is available to paid subscribers only. greatleadership.substack.com. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next week.